In this video, I'm going to be showing you some of the basic 3D tools in Photoshop by applying a label to this cylinder shape. And a lot of times when people apply labels to cylinders in Photoshop, they do it in kind of this approximate way where they warp it into place, they add some lighting, and it usually looks pretty good. But sometimes you want to be a little bit more mathematically precise, and 3D tools will allow you to do that. So before we start doing 3D in Photoshop, we first have to add the 3D window to our tabs over here. So we'll just go up to Window and go down to 3D, and then I'll just add it to this space. Or it'll add it up here and you can just drag it into the tabs. And there's different things that you can do in this 3D panel. You can create objects based on extrusions or based on these basic meshes. And these basic shapes are really useful because if you think about it, most things in the world are created out of one of these basic shapes. So we're going to be creating a cylinder, and we're going to align that cylinder with this package, which will allow Photoshop to do its magic. But before we do that, we're actually going to create a new layer. If we have the background layer selected when we do that, it'll actually take that photograph and wrap it around our cylinder, which is not what we want. So we'll create a new layer here, and then make a mesh from preset and click create. So when you click this, it'll put you into this 3D mode. And when you're in 3D mode, you have this ground plane, which is this flat ground grid that's going to help you align objects in the 3D space. You also get this secondary view, which gives you some simplified view. In this case, we're looking at the cylinder from a top-down rotation. And when you're working in 3D, you have to just be a little bit more conscious of all the moves you make. It's not as quick and fast and intuitive as working in 2D, because 2D is really suited for a screen environment, which is a 2D space. 3D, the controls are a little bit clumsier and a little bit unintuitive, but after you get used to it, it'll be just fine. So the move tool is one of the main things you're going to be using, and with the move tool there are these different movements up here that you can use. Orbit is sort of the most general best default, I would say. So we'll select orbit, and there's two things you can do with any of these move functions. One is to move the actual object, and the second one is to move the camera. And that's one of the confusing things about working in 3D, is that you're always looking through the perspective of a camera. So if I click on the object itself, you'll see I'll get this bounding box around the object. And then when I use this orbit tool, you can see it just moves the object around. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that by clicking Command Z, and any movement you do in Photoshop in 3D can be undone, whether it's to the object itself or to the camera. So if I don't want to move the object and want to move the camera instead, I can instead click outside the object, or I can click on this current view in the 3D panel over here, and that's going to allow me to move the camera. And when I move the camera, you can see that now the ground plane is moving because we're moving the camera around rather than twisting the object. And in general, you're going to want to move the camera more often than you want to move the object. Because when you move the object, you're kind of rotating it relative to the ground plane, and it makes it harder for you to align things together. So in general, move the camera if you're in doubt. So that's what the orbit tool does. It kind of like keeps your distance from the object the same and moves you around. So it's really useful for just seeing things from different angles and visualizing your object. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Let's look at some of these other movements as well. So this is the roll feature, which actually just rolls the object like this. And it's not that useful, but in certain situations, it's something you're going to want to use. This tool here is called the, what is it called? It's called the pan tool. I always forget the names. But the pan tool basically moves things up, down, left, and right. So it basically ignores the z-axis, which is the depth axis, and just moves things up, down, left, and right. So it's kind of like working with it in a 2D space. And then this tool, I think it's called the slide tool. Let's see. Come on, Photoshop, tell me what it is. Yep, the slide tool. The slide tool is pretty similar to the pan tool, that if you move it back and forth, it does the same thing. But if you push up and down, it actually slides you closer or further away to the object. So that can be pretty useful as well. This last one is the zoom tool, which is kind of similar, but basically instead of moving closer, you're actually zooming the lens in and out. So remember, since you're looking through the perspective of this camera, cameras can kind of zoom in or out, which is different than how we see objects because our eyes only work from one focal length. So in general, I don't really use the zoom tool very much. I prefer the slide tool, but in certain situations, if you're building a photographic scene, you might zoom the camera. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and undo that. So first thing we want to do is align this cylinder to the cylinder in the photograph. And remember, the photograph is still just this dumb 2D object. Photoshop doesn't treat it any differently because we're in 3D mode. It doesn't know that the 2D object has any 3D elements in it. So let's go ahead and turn off this layer for a second so we can sort of look at the cylinder and visualize it. And you can see that we're seeing it from pretty much straight on. It's pretty much a profile view, but we're actually looking at it from a slight elevated angle. You can see that because we can see a little bit of the top here, and also because of the way these things curve here. The bottom curves down, but the top also curves very slightly down. If we were looking at it from straight on, like we are this cylinder, you can see the top would curve up and the bottom would curve down. And that would mean that we were looking at it exactly at the midpoint of the object. So in order to match these things up, we're going to have to rotate our view of the 3D cylinder to match that. We're also going to have to change the height and zoom it in or out so it aligns with the package. So let's go back to the 3D mode here and go to current view. And first let's actually use the slide tool to slide the cylinder back into space, just so we're a little bit closer to the cylinder there. And then let's use the orbit tool and just rotate it up. So you can see now we're starting to align it a little bit closer with the cylinder. Let's slide it a little bit more. There we go. So we just move it up with the pan tool. And now let's look at the height. So I think we're pretty close here, but let's turn this layer down to 50% opacity just so we can see kind of where we're at. And I think this cylinder is just a little bit taller than the cylinder underneath. So if I go back to 3D and click on the cylinder, we can start using some of these tools to change the cylinder. And these tools are really useful. They're, again, a little bit clumsy to use, but you have all three axes here, the y-axis, the x-axis, and the z-axis. And for all three, you have three different things you can do. One is move, the second one is rotate, and the third one is scale. So if you want to scale something along the x-axis, you just hover over that icon there, and then click and drag out, and you can see it's going to make it wider because that's what scaling along the x-axis is going to do. I'll go ahead and undo that. If you rotate around this axis, you can see that it's going to rotate the cylinder around. It looks the same because cylinders, are symmetrical around that axis, but that's what it's doing. And if you hover over the move, you can move it one way or the other. In this case, I actually hovered over the z-axis by accident, so it was moving it in and out of depth. So these kind of do similar things to the move tools, but they allow you to do really controlled movements. And in the middle here, you have a cube, and if you hover over that, oops, there it is, you can scale it uniformly. So that's the fourth thing you can do. And you can do all those from all the different axes. So in this case, we want to move the object a little bit up on the y-axis so that it's more aligned with this thing. And then let's also scale it along the y-axis to make it just a little bit shorter. There we go. That looks good. And I still think we need to work on our rotation a little bit. So let's use the orbit tool. Just rotate into place. I think that's looking pretty good there. And let's actually lower the height just a little bit more. Okay. So let's go back and turn this to 100% opacity so we can see what we're doing. You can see we're pretty much aligned with the cylinder in the package. And I actually think we need to just use the roll tool to just rotate it ever so slightly, and then the pan tool to just move it a little bit over. There we go. That looks pretty good. So now that we have our cylinder in place, what we can do is apply our label to it. And the interesting thing about 3D shapes, and you know this if you play especially like old video games, is that they're made up of triangles. There's actually no smooth curves in 3D. It's actually an approximation of a smooth curve by using a bunch of triangles. And you can see that if I click on scene and turn on this lines, you can see the mesh that's creating this cylinder. And it gets all smoothed out in Photoshop to make it look as smooth as possible, but it's still just an approximation. And so that polygonal shape is then wrapped with certain textures and lighting effects to create things that look 3D. So what we want to do is alter the texture that's on this cylinder with our label to make it applied to the cylinder. So if we go into the 3D panel and click on the cylinder, it's going to select this shape. But you can also see that there's these sub-tabs, which are for the cylinder materials. And basically a cylinder is made out of 3 different sections of material. The cylinder material is the outside wrap. The top is the part that makes up the top, the little circle. And the bottom is the bottom circle that makes up the bottom. And so we can alter the texture that goes on any one of these things. So in this case, we're going to want to alter the outside cylinder material. So we're going to click on this, and we're actually going to go up to this thing called Diffuse. And what Diffuse is it's what the texture looks like if there's just really, really soft lighting on it. So these other things have to do with how the texture actually responds to different types of light. But Diffuse is really the main thing that we're looking at. So if I go into here and go to Edit Texture, just clicking on that little icon, it's going to open up this PSB file. And this is really similar to if you open a smart object in Photoshop, and it gives you the opportunity to edit it and then save that, and it puts it back into that thing that you edited from. So we've got this PSB file here. And if we go into Illustrator and grab our label that I've created, oops, it's going to give us a little spinning bar. There we go. Go ahead and copy that. Go back into Photoshop, and then we'll just paste that and put it into place. Just kind of blow that up to size and just put it right in. There we go. And then we can go ahead and close and save that. And when we save that, it's going to bring that into our cylinder shape, which is what it did. So there we go. That's what we wanted. And now we just want to rotate this around so we see the right thing. So let's go ahead and hover over this, rotate around the y-axis, and we'll just turn it into place. There we go. Cool. So that's how we basically apply the label. But the next thing we need to do is start matching the lighting up, because the lighting for this isn't quite right. If we go back and turn off this layer, you can see kind of how the lighting is affecting this scene. There's a main key light over here on this side of the cylinder, and then there's also some kind of fill on this side that's creating a little bit of light here. And then there's kind of this strip of more dark space in the middle. So Photoshop will allow us to simulate these lights by using lights. So if I turn this back on, go back to 3D, you can see that there's this thing called an infinite light that is automatically created whenever you create a 3D scene. And an infinite light is called that because it's a type of light that is where the light source is infinitely far away. So whenever we're using an infinite light, the only thing we can actually adjust is direction and intensity, because the position of the light relative to the objects in the scene don't actually matter. So in this case, what we're going to do is rotate to one side to simulate that key light. And you can see how that's affecting the lighting, so it's really lighting this one side. And when you think about infinite lights, the closest analog is really the sun, because the sun, for all intents and purposes, is infinitely far away. Even though it's not totally infinitely far away, its position is pretty much fixed. So go ahead and rotate that to one side. And then to bring in the fill light, we'll actually click on this button here to create a new light. And I know you can't see it, but it gives you 3 options for a point light, a spotlight, or an infinite light. So I'm going to click Create New Infinite Light. And it's going to bring a new one in. So now I have Infinite Light 1, Infinite Light 2, and Infinite Light 2. I'm just going to turn it so it's coming from this direction. And I'm going to turn down the intensity a little bit on this one, because this is the fill. So there we go. Click back on scene, and you can see that I'm starting to emulate that lighting a little bit better. And let's actually create a third infinite light as well. And this one we're just going to use to raise the ambient level of the light itself. So we'll just point this directly at the label here, and we'll turn this intensity way, way down. There we go. So you can see if I turn that off and back on, it's just creating a little bit more of a fill so that that part of the label isn't in total darkness. Okay, so now that we have this all set up, we can actually go back to non-3D mode and treat this just like anything else in Photoshop. So I've created a path here, and the path is going to allow us to make a selection of this shape. So I've already kind of cut out the cylinder. So I'm just going to go ahead and right click on this, click Make Selection, and feather it just a little bit. Then go back to Layers, and I'll just create a layer mask on this, just so it masks it into our shape. There we go. So that's looking pretty good. And then the last thing we need to do to really finish this off is actually render the object. So when you're working in Photoshop, you're actually looking at an approximation of the rendering that's existing in the program. So if I go to 3D and click on this layer here and click on scene, you can see that it's a little bit jagged. It doesn't look perfect, but there's this little button here that says render. And when you click this, it's going to start this process. Your computer fan will start to spin up because it's really going to be intensive. And what it's going to do is it's going to go through this process of what's called ray tracing. And it's called ray tracing because it actually uses a physics engine and bounces light off of the object according to where the lights are positioned in the composition, and figures out how those objects are going to react to the lighting that's being shown. And so it's going to give you a closer and closer approximation of how it would look in the real world the longer you run this ray tracing for. So the ray tracing can take a while to do, but if you're looking to have a final composition, it'll just make things a little bit more clean and a little bit more sort of perfect. And this is one of the reasons that 3D takes so long to do. Like the original Pixar movies took days and days to render because every frame in the movie actually has to be ray traced through this process. And when you're working with a lot of different 3D objects and complex lighting, that can actually just take a ton of time. So you can see it's just ray tracing away. And if I stop this process at any time by clicking escape, I can sort of live with whatever came out of the ray tracing up to that point. But the longer I let it go, the more precise the ray tracing will be. But depending on how precise you need it to be for any particular application, you can just go ahead and stop it. So I'll stop it for now. And we can just sort of look at our final result here. If I click off of the 3D mode, it looks pretty good. And so that's how you use 3D to apply a label in Photoshop. Next time I'll be showing you guys some other tools that are going to help you with 3D printing, so stick around for that, and I'll see you in the next video.